Hello, everyone. Nikole, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. I can't tell you how much my your star power has, like, kind of rubbed off on this event and on me. So it's such a pleasure. We're here to talk about censorship and the ways in which that has been such an overriding but strangely under-discussed in a certain way aspect of our landscape lately, especially around, on many different levels, but on college campuses, especially the kind of dismantling of DEI at local school levels, the banning of certain texts, including the 1619 Project. And so I was hoping that you could just talk about how you see that playing out and what you think the kind of conditions of it are.
Sure. Hello. Y'all can speak back. We're intimate, right? This is an intimate crowd for a Brooklyn event, so I feel like we should be able to have a great conversation. So yeah, we were kind of talking a little bit backstage. It is clearly an interesting and distressing time in America right now. I can say, I guess I wouldn't say proudly say, but so much of this recent wave of bans, the genesis was the very specific targeting of the 1619 Project. That right around the time of the George Floyd protests, we really saw this orchestrated campaign to not just discredit the project, but to remove the project from the classroom. So Mitch McConnell and Tom Cotton introduced the Saving America History Act. I love the name of that. I'm sure the fact, and this was a Senate bill to strip federal funding from any school that taught the 1619 Project. And as far as we can tell, only the 1619 Project is mentioned in specific legislation as a specific text that's being banned from the classroom, and then that led to a wave of anti-1619 Project state bills, some which passed, most which didn't. And when those 1619 Project state bills didn't pass, then that was followed with a wave of what we have come to call the anti-critical race theory propaganda campaign. And the divisive concept laws. And many of those bills actually did pass, of course. And then that wasn't enough, right? So after targeting what they called critical race theory, but which was often just any discussions of race, racism, the history of racism, Black history, and especially anything dealing with LGBTQ identity, then they started attacking what they called DEI and then actually attacking DEI. So we're now, of course, seeing the use of state power to close entire DEI offices on public college campuses, as we were talking about backstage as well. This is particularly distressing because these are grown people on college campuses that the state is saying need to be protected from DEI, and that the state is actually saying that campuses cannot have DEI offices, that in some cases they have to change campus curricula. They're closing multicultural centers in places with large multicultural populations. And yet, how much pushback have we seen against this? And I think what's most disturbing to me is most of these dismantling, Texas, Iowa, Arkansas, you can just go down the list, have occurred with almost no protest, almost no commentary, and almost no pushback. And that to me is actually the most distressing thing of all.
Well, partly we were, partly what seems so interesting as well as we were talking about was the fact that so many of these DEI programs to begin with were so conceived so superficially, right? And were designed not to be able to make the kind of deep structural changes that one might have to make, right? By giving the heads of these programs almost no power, by giving them almost no budget, and by limiting already what they could do. And so, the idea of then dismantling them is adding insult to injury, right? You've already created the conditions in which DEI is so difficult to attain, and then taking them away. The other real consequence of it, and this is terrifying to me, and really underlines your observation that there's been no pushback, is that what the next stage of this is just getting rid of all African American, Black, or other faculty, because if you're not allowed to talk about the history of racism, that negates much of what Black and other minority faculty members are doing on campuses to begin with, right? So it's really a purge, the beginning of a purge.
Right, and I think you just make the atmosphere inhospitable to that faculty.
Exactly.
And would I take a job in Texas right now as a faculty? Absolutely not. Would I want to work on a campus that has disbanded its multicultural department? Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. Would I even, some of you may have heard I had a slight debacle with the University of North Carolina a few years ago.
I was hoping you'd mention that.
Which is now, through its Board of Governors, also eliminating DEI on campuses there. Would I feel comfortable teaching in a classroom there? Yeah. Absolutely not. And so you have the people who just a few years ago during the so-called racial reckoning were talking about intolerance of speech on college campuses, right? This was their primary issue, is that the left was intolerant, that people could not feel free who are more conservative or had more conservative views, or in some cases had really repugnant racist views, sexist views, were not allowed to speak freely on campus, have now, within a few short years, become the same people who are literally using state power to prohibit speech on campus, to tell a university that has decided that diversity is important, which in a multicultural society we would think is a given, that they actually cannot do that if that's what they choose to do. So I think it's part of this larger, really dangerous period that we're in, right? Like any society that is veering towards authoritarianism, that's seeing a weakening democracy, the first thing that they go after are writers, right? Public intellectuals and creatives. Because in order to pave the way for regressive policy, you have to control the narrative first, right? You have to control how we're thinking about our society. If you feel like you're under attack, if you feel like your history, your experience is being delegitimized, if you actually believe that the real racists are those who are racist against white people, then when they want to pass these laws and policies, you support them. So that's why, you attack a program like 1619. That's why you treat the trans issue as being the biggest concern in society, as somehow oppressing women. That's why you pick the marginalized groups to target, because this is how we allow Americans to basically to condone the shrinking of our own rights. And that's what this really is all about, is the taking away of our collective rights, but acting like we're doing that to protect the rights of a majority.
There's a fantastic classic book by a guy named Klaus, I'll never pronounce his last name correctly, someone say it, it's called Male Fantasies, and it's a fantastic two-part book that he wrote about the rise of Nazi Germany, and he was talking about the ways in which he talks about the ways in which it was this discourse coming from racial, gender, sexual, all sorts of directions to sort of fortify the concept of the national body, right? So you get away from any understanding of the body as different, right? Any marks of difference become a level of attack, and it feels like just the same playbook that we're living through now with the attacks on trans bodies, the attacks on women's bodies, the attacks on LGBTQ bodies, everything like that, and then of course the attacks on the racialized body as well. So that's it does very much feel like that moment. But one of the things that's always been fascinating to me, and I think you were talking about the way in which this sort of discourse of white reactionaries feeling chilled in their speech. One of the things that seemed to me happened so quickly and so easily is the way the language of, on the one hand, the attacks on, snowflakes, right? And woke, these woke young people who, and snowflakes who need trigger warnings. It did two things. It reduced very valid complaints about structural racism into a matter of feelings, right? That people were triggered by it, and so that was what their main complaint was. But then simultaneously based all of these sort of bans on the idea of discomfort. We can't make white kids, whether they're in elementary school or college, uncomfortable with the ideas that they're hearing. And for me, especially seeing the student encampments that we've seen over the last couple of months, so much of that, so much of the reasoning behind these really repressive actions on the part of university administrations, bringing in police to sort of often violently clear peaceful protests and everything like that, again, was based on the idea of feelings. We have to be concerned about the feelings of certain students who may feel like a protest in favor of a ceasefire is somehow an attack on their identity. And I think that, I mean, one of the things that's sort of interesting to me is the way in which all of these sort of discourses get both reduced and then co-opted by the right. And I feel like that's been very much what's happened in reaction to the 1619 Project.
Yeah, I mean, so one, so much of media has also, right, played into this narrative of false balance between the two political parties, false balance between, for instance, students on a diverse campus kind of democratically protesting something and saying, we don't like this speaker, and balancing that and treating that as equivalent to the state saying you cannot talk about these things on a college campus. You cannot offer a course on these things on a college campus. That's not the same thing, right? Using state power to prohibit speech is very different than us engaging in a democratic process of protest and saying, we don't like this thing. Now, you can argue about whether that went too far on college campuses or not. I would say no. I would say that that's the push and pull of any democratic society. But so often, when we treat these as the same, then we're legitimizing the use of state power to suppress speech that they don't like, and often in extremely democratic ways. If you look at, for instance, the Board of Governors in the university in North Carolina, it's not reflective of the state. It's not reflective politically or racially of the state. It's also not reflective of the university. These are all Republican appointees in a state that's actually about half and half, though gerrymandered so that political power isn't shared. In my home state of Iowa, the Board of Regents also has now a limited DEI on its 3 college campuses, and the state law requires political balance. So the way they've done that is they have half Republicans and the other half are independents that vote Republican. There's no Democrats, right? So they can say we have political balance because we have half who are not Republicans, but they're not reflective of the state. So what we're seeing in K-12, what we're seeing in the higher ed level, and frankly, what we're seeing across corporations who also, to me, were just one, we know there was never a serious commitment to transformative change after George Floyd, right? It was all very performative. We know now that almost none of the money that was pledged was actually delivered. We know that it seems to me they were waiting for the Supreme Court to rule against affirmative action so they could throw up their hands and say, well, actually, the court won't allow us to do anything now. We might be sued. That there was never a serious commitment to these things in the first place. So when we see that happening in K-12, when we see it happening at the college level, it's all responding to the same thing, which is a nation that's becoming more and more diverse, a sense that people who have not had to share power, who didn't have to argue with people about what would be taught and how, now are having to do that for the first time and refusing to do so. And I think your example of the divisive concepts is perfect, right? Because as, people of color, these laws are clearly not about whether students of color feel comfortable in the classroom, whether a curriculum that erases students of color, that erases LGBTQ students, that marginalizes them, whether that's the problem. The problem is only if white students are being forced to think about a history, and then we're led to believe that a teaching force that's 80% white women was somehow telling white children that they're the devil, right? That they're the evil oppressor. Like it defied logic, and yet, as journalists, we know that that's how journalists were covering it. So frankly, I think a lot of our so-called allies, a lot of people who think they're progressive, also were waiting for this course correction. I think they also felt that coming out of 2020, things went too far, right? You also saw people who were so-called progressive embracing this language of wokeness gone too far, right? And really feeling that, we're not like MAGA over here, but y'all were starting to ask for a little too much.
Well, I feel like the sort of panic over, people can't, teach things anymore because students are going to freak out and things have gone so far that I can't teach X, Y, and Z anymore. I do feel like that was really embraced by the kind of liberal, the liberal side of things, right? As this part of this like panic over overcorrection, that the panic over the stifling of conservative speech on campus and whatever, or the and again goes back to I really think that there's a way in which you point out, right, this difference between the legitimate side of protest versus actual state ban of speech, right? Which is what we are seeing in the DEI, the prohibition about talking about critical race theory, right? Like this complete non-category category. It just seems to encompass whatever someone doesn't like, right? It becomes or the inability to discuss Palestine at all on college campuses, right? That those are actually state bans, right? Or the administration, university administration acting on the demands of the state, right? Which becomes a state ban, versus this other thing, which is I've had a lot of especially white academics say to me that my book, which is just about art, it's not even about the shift in a historical narrative the way 1619 Project is that it's becoming more and more difficult. They tell me it's becoming more and more difficult to teach your book because it talks about stuff that students don't want to hear about.
Which is what I thought one went to college for, right? Was
exactly.
Have your views challenged, to have to think about things that you hadn't thought about. Like that, to me, is what college was supposed to be for.
Yeah. But I've never had a black faculty member say the same thing to me, right? I mean, in the sense that, it really is about, I do feel like there's a level to which the sort of white discomfort with the momentousness, say, of the sea change that 1619 Project really sort of ushered in is that there are excuses, like our students won't, they're putting a lot on the students, a lot of responsibility on the students, I think is what I'm saying, instead of taking that responsibility as faculty members as well. You know, they get blamed for a lot.
Yeah, I mean, again, we, especially, you know, in a place like Brooklyn, really like to look askance at what we see as conservatives doing, and don't seem to acknowledge that we have been partners in so much of what conservatives are doing. I mean, just think about that famous Harper's letter, which all of these, I would say many of them, progressive writers signed about the intolerance on college campuses. And yet, where's the Harper's letter about the literal state bans on DEI on college campuses, the literal bans on teaching ethnic studies in certain college campuses? There's silence. Like, look at The Atlantic. I mean, The Atlantic has like 5 people whose job it just seems to write anti-woke screeds, right? It's like, how many times can you recycle the same story? But apparently you can, and it's okay. Endlessly. Like, cover that. But the balance is gone, and the people who you think would be defending against this are actually saying, well, yeah, you know, we did need a course correction. Things did go too far. You know, y'all were asking for too much, and so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that as we're seeing these bans move across the country, that there isn't pushback, because I think a lot of people, again, who call themselves allies, actually sort of agree with them.
Well, you know, there's also the other part of it, right? Which is that college campuses have reduced DEI to, like, you know, receptions and like, we're gonna have mixers or whatever, and not actually, you know, as I said, like, not done anything not made it structurally possible to make more deep-seated changes, right? So part of me does wonder for students of, well, first of all, no one's asking students of color whether these programs are actually, you know, benefiting them in any way. But second of all, no one seems to be concerned about what now the fate of students of color will be on campuses that is, you know, predominantly white institutions, right?
Yeah, of course not. I mean, here's the thing. Like, if these bans were, the state should not be banning things, right? They should not be banning positions. The state should not be deciding. Often unelected people, right? Most times, board of governors, trustees, they're appointed positions, should not be saying you cannot teach these things. Like, that's, to me, like, I just don't understand how we're comfortable with that, no matter what it is. So let's just, you know, put that out there. But if these were coming from a place of, you know, DEI really hasn't been effective, that would be one thing. Yeah. But that's not where they're coming from. And in fact, because we know DEI has often been window dressing, then we have to understand that the attacks are about something different. Exactly. The attacks are about, you know, maintaining hegemony, right? They're about saying that these college campuses were designed for one type of student, and you are here, but we are not going to address you and your particular experiences and your particular needs. They're about sending a message of exclusion, right? If I'm on a campus, for instance, University of Northern Iowa, where I told you I was just down there reporting after DEI was banned there. They closed the LGBTQ office because the Regents the State Board of Regents said you have to close anything dealing with DEI unless it is federally required. So like Title IX, they can't mess with because it's federally required. So they closed that office. They were getting ready to close the Multicultural Center. And if I'm a student on that campus, that sends a very clear message to me about belonging, about whether I will have a safe space or not. And they closed them because they say they made white, straight students feel excluded. Now you have the whole damn campus. You literally have the whole campus. And what we know about these spaces is they're always inclusive, right? Like, I don't know an LGBTQ center that says straight people can't come to the programming, we don't want you here. So it's really about messaging about exclusion and who these campuses belong to. So when we don't fight back, then we're also telling those students, this place is not really for you. And y'all, if y'all don't think that this has to do, again, with the changing demographics of our country and the general attacks, the efforts to delegitimize public education, period, whether for K-12 or higher ed, as public education has become more black and brown, as higher ed has become more black and brown, then we see a desire to really discredit, delegitimize, and disinvest in those areas. My state of Iowa used to be known, right, as the education state. Really? I mean, every person growing up most people would take the Iowa test of basic skills, right? This was like a standardized test. We were known as a state with very well-funded schools, very well-functioning public schools, and very high-quality public universities. Mm-hmm. And now we see an effort to completely disinvest from those institutions, which is crazy for a state that valued that, and a state that is still, by the way, something like 93% white. But it's wrapped up in this larger grappling, which so many journalists have called economic anxiety, but it was never economic anxiety. It's demographic anxiety. And we have to get right with that. Look, multiracial democracy is messy. Right? The reason the Republican Party is able to be so in lockstep is if you are a single race party that purges all people who are different, it's easy to get everyone to do what you want. A big tent party struggles, right? But I think that's good, because when you have some conservatives, some progressives, different racial groups, people who identify different sexually, you cannot veer too far in one direction, right? You have to kind of come to the middle on things. And it's harder. It's harder to reach consensus. It's harder to do things. But when you do them, they tend to be more broad and for more people. So we, therefore, are grappling with a society that is becoming more and more diverse. And yet we have one group, which is really a minority party that is determining, because they're a minority party, but also a single race party, they're able to kind of force the rest of us to live under their very stingy, old school, like 1950s was the greatest period in American version of American life. And we're not nearly as organized in pushing back as we try to grapple with the diversity amongst ourselves.
You know, right after...
Y'all are alive. Excellent.
Right after Trump got elected, I spend a lot of time in Montana, and which is where...
God, why?
I know. It's actually...
It is beautiful, though.
It is beautiful.
If you're passing through.
And that's the town where my parents have a cabin is the town that Richard Spencer moved to live in his parents' basement, basically after Trump's election. And there was a moment where he was encouraging neo-Nazi white supremacist groups to converge on Whitefish, Montana. And they were sending around posting flyers and everywhere. And what was so interesting to me is that their platform, right, this sort of neo-Nazi platform that was that they were supporting, was that we will give you universal health care, we will give you free education, we will give you, but
sounds amazing.
Only for
Except
the
for the white
whites.
supremacist
right.
part, yeah.
And and it was so fascinating because it was like, yeah, they want all this, they just don't
want us to get it.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, and I'll say that this town in Montana literally ran him and his parents out of town. Like the parents had to close their business and they had to leave.
No, it was because they didn't want universal health care.
Yeah, no, exactly.
They were like, get that socialist shit out of here. We don't care about the white supremacists.
I know, exactly.
Socialism gotta go.
It was pretty funny, but it was so telling, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not that they don't want to take care of people, they just don't want to take care of certain people,
yes.
right? And that's the reason for the attempts to dismantle public education, the attempts to dismantle even the universities now. Like that's what's
yes.
behind it, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and to me, so yes, one, we just know that. There's a great book called Democracy in Chains, and it really kind of traces the erosion of this sense of a public good of course, to the civil rights movement, that we believed in investing in public goods until black people became a part of the public that you actually had to serve. And then we stopped investing in public hospitals. We stopped investing in, oftentimes in public parks, right? The rise of like private golf courses and private swimming pools, and even people getting swimming pools in their own backyards happens with integration when black folks now get access to these public areas, the disinvestment in public schools. So far, libraries have held, but we'll see, right? So
I mean, not in New York.
well, you know, y'all elected y'all mayor, so I don't want to hear about it. That's all I'm gonna say about that. But so when you compare the United States to other high-income countries, and particularly European countries, right? They have a social safety net that we aspire to. And that's because they have not had to deal with race in the same way until recently. And so you see now the erosion in Europe of public support, of these social safety net and these public investments as the revenge of empire, right? And colonialism means now people of color from the nations that they colonized abroad now are wanting to move to the mother country and get those services. So we have always seen enough white Americans willing to sacrifice their own good to keep what they think are larger numbers of people of color, but specifically black people, from benefiting from public goods to our own detriment, right? Like, we are an exceptional nation, but in most of the ways we're exceptional, we should be ashamed.
Yes.
Right? And truly, right? Highest rates of child poverty of the industrialized world, highest wealth inequality, the only one of those countries that we compare ourselves to where whether you go to the doctor or not depends on if you have a job that feels like giving you health insurance, the only one of those countries with no maternal health leave after you've had a child, most carceral nation in the world. Like, we can go down the list of the ways that we're exceptional because we don't want to deal with race. But this is why I think the 1619 Project, and then what they called critical race theory, and at first said, no, we're not trying to ban black history, but DeSantis is like, no, actually, we are trying to ban black history, and we will ban black history, is because what happens with the 1619 Project and other texts that were similar to the project in the wake of 2020 was many Americans were starting to put things together, right? So I probably studied this more than any living person. Obsessively, right? And I've paid a lot of attention to the polling at the height of the George Floyd protests. And at the height of the protests, 7 out of 10 Americans said they had had a discussion about race in their household. That's astounding, right? 7 out of 10. 1 out of 10 Americans took part in those protests, which is a rate we have never seen, right? And we're talking about not just in places like Brooklyn, but like Vidor, Texas. Population 1% black, that was still like fighting the federal government to integrate its public housing in the 1990s. They held a Black Lives Matter march there. And the number that sticks out to me the most is that 40%, actually about 44% of self-identified conservatives said that racism was a primary obstacle to black Americans' advancement. Now, why is that the most compelling number? Because we know this is the party of individual responsibility, right? That there's no systemic racism in the United States. Where black people suffer, it's because of our own pathology. And 44% of them, nearly half, were saying, actually, there's something bigger in our society that is holding black people back. That, y'all, was narrative that helped people understand that. And that's why the response to that, the backlash to that, was to take control of that narrative, turn it around, co-opt the language of the movement, co-opt the language of the civil rights movement, and now say they've gone too far, and now they're racist against you. They're trying to tell your kids that they're racist. They're trying to take everything from you. They want to take your history. They want to say that there's something wrong with being white, so we have to stop that. That's what we're seeing right now. But it is really because people were drawing conclusions. I became a journalist because I understood that narrative, more than anything else, drives policy. I don't know if there's any researchers in here, but you know, you can do a peer-reviewed study. You could spend 20 damn years on that study. That's not driving shit. It's does that story get written about and how, right? think about crime policies. Think about almost any policy you know. It's very seldom made publicly based on what does the research, the data, and the facts show. What are the best practices? It's based on public perception. Mm-hmm. And so if we can create a narrative of America that says we were actually founded not on ideals of freedom, but the practice of slavery, mm-hmm. that so much of the inequality that not just Black Americans face, but really all Americans, like white people in America live shorter lives, less healthy lives, and poorer lives than white people in Europe. Yeah. So our system is actually hurting a lot of white people too. It's just hurting us more. Mm-hmm. That if you have an understanding of your society in that way, then you're going to support different policy. You're going to support policy that tries to redistribute some of that wealth, mm-hmm. that doesn't congratulate a man who makes so much money that as a hobby, he can go to the fucking moon, right? And then has the audacity to thank the low-wage Amazon worker who has to pee in a jar because they can't go to the restroom for making that possible. That's one narrative. But if your narrative is, this is the land of opportunity, the American dream, anybody who wants to work hard can make it, and if you don't make it, it's because you're lazy and you haven't tried enough. And we don't owe you anything. We don't need to help you pay your rent. We don't need to help educate your kids. We don't need to do anything for you. If you buy that version, then you accept the society we have right now. Mm-hmm. Then you accept a society where a Supreme Court judge can admit that he has taken all of this millions of dollars, and we say there's nothing we could do about it. That's just capitalism, right? So this is why we see the bans that we're having is too many Americans. We're starting to understand a different narrative of our society and saying that narrative means we need to do something about that we can have a better society if we choose. And why would people in power want that?
Yeah. I'm also fascinated with the ways in which so much of this is playing out in elementary, high school, elementary to high school education, and especially around the question of trans rights, because I feel like at this point, it's extraordinary that there was a sort of moment at which a lot of kids felt permission finally to kind of explore gender in ways that were unrecognizable to their parents' generation, more or less. And at that point, I think a lot of parents felt like they had lost control, because the moment you lose patriarchy, you've lost everything else, kind of thing. And the same thing with race and racism, that their kids perhaps weren't as automatically racist as they expected that they should be. If you're my kid, of course you're going to know that you should think this, that, and the other of people of color, and that so much of this is focused on schools is really fascinating to me, because it really is about like reclaiming your property, right? Your children are your property, and you're reclaiming and you're seeing your property kind of tainted by these forces beyond your control.
Yeah. So I don't feel like what we know from the last 4 years, again, I'm going to kind of date this back to 2020, which of course is the collision of COVID and the George Floyd protests. And of course, what COVID does for many of us is we're getting to peer into our kids' classrooms for the first time because they're all on Zoom.
Interesting.
So I think that what we saw, though, is coverage that was making it appear that this pushback was like grassroots pushback, that the pushback against what was happening about whether students should be able to self-identify, pronouns, all of those things, as if we just started using pronouns. I've used pronouns my entire life, never seemed to be a problem. All we were saying is, if I want to be identified by a certain pronoun, respect me and call me that, right? That this was about really parents, but it really wasn't. And what we know now from people who've done the reporting is that these were AstroTurf campaigns of people who saw an in, because classrooms have always been a battleground. There's a reason why, if you look at the civil rights movement, some of the ugliest resistance, the resistance that was almost entirely being led by white women, by the way, by mothers, was against school desegregation. And that was because schools are very intimate settings, right? They are, we get very emotional when it comes to our children, so it's easiest to scare us in a space like that because we feel like we have lost control, right? No other aspect of my child's life is my child away from me for 8 hours a day, in the hands of strangers, basically, and I don't know what's happening. But in schools, I don't. And so folks who had a larger project, which was to sow division, to polarize society so that they could justify and pass their very regressive agenda, understood the power of scaring parents about what was happening in the classroom. Your kids are being indoctrinated. Your kids are being shamed. Your kids didn't know anything about being gay until they came in a classroom. And now, what did they say? The kids were, some of the public schools were allowing kids to live like cats and go to, the bathroom in a litter box. No, this was like a real thing. It wasn't a real thing in that it never happened, but it went across like parents who were worried like it was a real thing. So like the most ludicrous shit you ever heard, they were buying into this fear, and then it becomes kind of this frenzy. So that's what happened with, trans people are about 1% of the population. So on the one hand, it's amazing that they're finally getting visibility, that they are not being completely erased. But on the other hand, to have entire, bodies of legislation and women who are like, oh my God, we're gonna lose everything now because of fear that like a single trans woman might win a beauty pageant. For God's sake, like who fucking cares? Right, but it is all based on this notion of scarcity, right? That we have a limited amount of rights. We have a limited amount of resources. And if someone else is ascending, that must mean I'm descending. And again, what I tell my students all the time is if you want to get to the crux of why and who, just look at who's benefiting from the division.
Yeah.
Just look at like who's able to roll us all because we're focusing on the wrong things. As Toni Morrison said, right, racism is a distraction because it has you focusing on the things that are not important while the oligarchy is like taking everything from almost all of us. And to be clear, I'm not saying the issues of trans rights are not important. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the outsized attention that they're getting, that are pitting us against people, right, who are literally just trying to live their lives, that is the distraction. And then that allows well-meaning people to accept not just regression there, but across American life.
To me, it's very much like if you see what the whole discourse around the idea of a Karen was.
No, the Karen thing is real. Okay,
no, the Karen thing is real. No, the Karen thing is real. The Karen thing is absolutely real. And when Black folks were using this as a kind of shorthand to talk about the ways in which white women were, relying on the policing power of the state and all of those sorts of things to in fact, to just act out their racism via these state arms, it's absolutely real. But then it started, like, how many white men have you seen using the term Karen, calling a woman Karen, right? So then it gets co-opted by white men who see the usefulness of it, right, and redeploy it as, misogynist and whatever. It has, even the way that woke was used was a useful term, right, in Black conversations, and then got deployed as this, got co-opted by white men and got redeployed as this weapon. And I think that one of the things that's so fascinating is the way in which, this sort of working at cross purposes, right? There wouldn't be Karens if white women were better allies, right? We wouldn't have to spend so much time talking about that phenomenon if there was less complicity, right, on behalf of white women in these sort of repressive structures, right? And ultimately, who's benefiting from it? It's certainly not Black people, and eventually it's not white women either, as we're seeing with the way in which trans rights And abortion restrictions have gone the restriction of trans rights and the restriction of abortion have gone hand in hand, right? Like all the women complaining about trans women winning a beauty pageant have now, in half of the country been sentenced to death if they have an ectopic pregnancy or whatever it is, right? And the inability to think through that, the way in which those things are conjoined is so deeply dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. One, I think with the Karen thing, what was even worse and far more deeply cynical was white women began to argue that Karen was the equivalent of the N-word, right?
Oh, God. Yeah.
And that this was a racist slur. And I think that's instructive because this is what we're seeing really across American life, is this decontextualizing of a very specific history of subordination, right? That white women have never been subordinated to black people. Yeah. And so we equate things that are not the same, again, in order to justify policies that don't allow us to acknowledge the role that racial caste has played in the black experience, the reason why white women feel that they can police, not just white women, though, we say Karen, but it's white, Ahmaud Arbery died because white men believe white people. Read the Fear essay of the 1619 Project book, right? It goes back to the slave patrols. It goes back to the time of slavery where there was literal law that said by law, white people had to police black people. But you actually were breaking the law. If you saw a black person roaming around, walking around, and you did not question them, that you were actually breaking the law, that there was a requirement to police and question and maintain the slave system and make sure enslaved people were where they were supposed to be at all times. And so that then translates today to white people feeling they have the right to question black people in any space that they don't think black people belong in, right? So to equate the labeling of that with the history of the N-word, which was used as a tool of racial subordination and violence, it's the same way that they're using the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in order to end the subordination of people who had been enslaved, to ensure equal protection of the law of people who have been enslaved, and now use that to strike down programs that are trying to bring equality to people whose ancestors were enslaved. Just like they're now using the 1964 Civil Rights Act against black people. So that language, that propaganda that allows us to flip the meanings of things and to pretend that our society today exists in a vacuum, that it was just created today, that there hasn't been this whole history of racial subordination that got us to the society, to me is deeply, deeply problematic. And I think the other, Stuart Hall, who was a philosopher, he said, a black philosopher, that those who control the discourse therefore can make it true. Yeah. So it doesn't matter what the history is. It doesn't matter what the facts. If you control the discourse, and you can have us thinking today that if a white majority says, okay, we're going to set aside 5% of seats at a university for people whose ancestors were enslaved and who have a long history of discrimination, then that's the same thing as that white majority segregating black people, that these two things are the same because they both take race into account. Yeah. If you control the discourse, then you can make that true. Yeah. But it's not actually true. No. When the 1619 Project first started getting attacked, and again, even in speaking with PEN America, we can't find another time where one text, right, has been banned in this type of legislation, really or attempted to be banned from the federal level down to the local school board level, like a single text, like entire laws being written around a single text. This all begins in 2020, and I was literally depressed by the lack of organizations, free speech organizations, the silence around these bans. Very few organizations spoke up against these bans. And I remember giving talks back then and saying, you think they're just going to come for the 1619 Project, right? There was silence because I think a lot of folks were uncomfortable. Even, again, our so-called allies were uncomfortable with the 1619 Project. So they didn't defend it. And then they came, of course, for entire fields. It was never going to be that. The same thing, of course, is true around the trans issue. That women, people who were born and gendered as women, thinking, I'm not going to speak up for them. That's not my struggle. And thinking the issue is only ever going to be around them. It's a lie, right? Like, you attack one marginalized group so that you can wage a larger attack. And so now, you know, we've woken up to an America where half of the country, as you said, lost the constitutional right. Women are literally dying because, you know, we're turning into the Handmaid's Tale here. And folks were silent against what was happening to trans women, thinking it was going to be contained. Y'all, it's never going to be contained. And even in a state like New York, I think we tend to think we're in a safe state. There are no safe states, right? If they can do this in one part of the country, you don't think our government can flip? You don't think we can see the same dynamics happening here? You don't think you could be traveling somewhere else and need health care as a woman and not be able to receive it? So this is why we have to understand that our fates are tied together. I don't have to have a complete understanding of every issue that someone has. What I do have to understand is that humanity is connected, and that I think one thing that Black people, particularly Black women, understand probably more than any other group, right, is that if anybody above us loses their rights, we're automatically losing ours. So we have to, you know, the Combahee Women's Collective, which meets in 1976 and puts out its manifesto in 1977, which was a group of Black feminists who said, you know, if Black women are free, then all people will be free, because Black women sit at the intersection of all oppression. Mm-hmm. If all of us could have that expansive view of humanity and understand that we all have to fight for and protect each other's rights, and even if we only do it for selfish-ass reasons, I'm okay with that. I don't want us to be selfish, but I'm okay with that.
I would say that it's better that we're acting on selfish reasons, understanding the way that all of our oppressions are connected. Yes. Because the alternative is the liberal model of bestowing rights, which of course is, you know, if you bestow rights, you know, if you have an idea that you're bestowing rights on other people, you also have some understanding that you can take away those rights if those people, you know, which I think is what happened after the George Floyd thing, that sort of retrenchment. You know, about 5 minutes ago, someone put up a sign that said that we had 5 minutes left.
We didn't pay
attention. But I was so fascinated listening to Nikole that I totally ignored it. But we do have some time for audience questions.
I'm from Miami originally. I've worked for 20 years in the community organizing space. I'm also an artist, so I've been back and forth to New York for 20 years, and I'm very grateful for some of the points you've brought up and very relevant to our communities. The real question is, you know, so two other background elements. 2018, as we worked to get Amendment 4 on the ballot to get voting rights restored to formerly incarcerated people, we actually won. And then DeSantis got elected. In this year, we were able to get the referendum of abortion on the ballot, which we're really proud of. And I was just wondering, now that we're a red state and now that a lot of the economic capital coming to Miami is actually coming from New York, California, all of this, right? But we're lacking the attention of the mainstream media to actually cover some of the issues that we're most proud and transgressive about. And what I want to ask, maybe it's a multi-tier question, what would you historically recommend that those of us who are advocating on the front lines focus on in our efforts? What is the most effective efforts we can make between now and November, not only to pass this amendment that we've gotten on the ballot, but also just we have so many things ahead of us to fight. And so what is our sharpest cutlass that we can use this year? Thank you for your work.
I'm going to answer, then I'll see what you have to say. And I'm going to give you a facetious answer, then I'll give you a sincere one. But the facetious one is actually a little bit sincere. So I always say that I became a journalist because, you know, my job is just to expose the shit, and y'all have to figure out how to fix it. I don't know. Honestly, I am in such a distressed state right now. I don't know what's going to happen in the country. I think a state like Florida is so hyper gerrymandered that it is hard for the will of the people to win. You know, every 4 years we're told you have to get out and vote. If you look at the numbers, Democrats get more votes. They get more votes for president, and they usually get more votes for the House. But because of gerrymandering and because of our electoral college system, it's anti-democratic. And so to keep telling people that voting is the answer when people vote, right? Black folks vote at the highest rate, and yet our conditions do not fundamentally change. Now, we should vote. We obviously can't cede that. But I don't know what the answer is. I feel the media is very broken in how we cover politics. I mean, when's the last time you see a story on the policy issues that either presidential candidates are voting on? When's the last time you saw a story on education? When's the last time you saw, and I say this of the national media, I actually think state and local media does the best job, and I would actually really focus your attention there. And people trust, right? They don't trust the national media, but they actually have pretty high levels of trust of state and local media, and that's really what affects our lives the most, right? You know, your governor has a much greater impact on the lives of the people in your state than Biden or Trump or whoever's in that White House. And yet we focus so much attention there, and we should, because now, you know, we have a wannabe dictator, so it does kind of matter. But it is a hard time to be hopeful. So the advice I give is not my own. I'm not a hopeful person. I feel a lot of damage is going to be done, and I feel like it is going to be a generational damage, right? Just looking at the Supreme Court alone, you know, we're going to have a court that's done and doing damage for at least 30 years. Now, we should take a strategy from conservatives and play our own 30 to 40-year game, which is what they did on Roe and which is what they did on civil rights. But what do we do right now, right? So I've been reading a lot of Timothy Snyder. I don't know if anybody in here has read Timothy Snyder, because I think it's so hard for us to imagine that America could become an authoritarian country, though if you're black, it shouldn't be that hard to imagine, because the vast history of us living in the country, that has been our experience. But I wanted to start reading someone who has studied authoritarianism in other places so I could better recognize the signs of what we're seeing. And what he said is, you know, basically our opposition, however you label that opposition, thrives on chaos. That they have us scattered and fighting on so many different fronts that it's hard to make progress on any of them. So each of us has to pick that one institution. This is what he says. Find the institution that is most important to you, or where you feel like you can have the most impact, and defend that. Don't try to fight every battle, because none of us can fight every battle. But we can say, my thing is public schools, so I'm going to fight the voucher laws, or I'm going to fight this, right? Or my issue is abortion, so can we get this measure passed in our state? And the last thing I'll say, I said I wasn't going to have advice, and yet I have a little bit. The last thing I'll say is, in many ways, you're going to have to bypass the media to get your message out. We have to, I hate this, I'm a journalist, right? I know how important we are. I know how important journalists are. Journalists like to pretend that we don't make the stories, but we do, because what we decide to cover and how determines so often the agenda and how the public understands or values anything. But I also think we have such a more democratized information landscape now that you can go much more directly to people. And not wait to have your message funneled through or ignored by the media when and if it decides to cover it. And I think you're going to have to really go back to grassroots campaigns, which of course is how that measure got passed in the first place, and how the anti-abortion measure hopefully will get passed as well. Or not anti-abortion measure. You know what I meant.
I also sympathize with activists who are trying to negotiate and do the really hard work in a lot of states where it feels like an uphill battle, and even in states where it shouldn't be an uphill battle. Like, I'm still very depressed about this congestion law situation, which, you know, but I do want to say that I think that Nikole's observation about picking your institution and just doing something about it. I think that one of the problems that you rightly point out is you feel so paralyzed by how many problems there are. What do you pick, and what do you? And you know, one of the real, I think. There's a tactic, I think, that people who are ultimately not fundamentally progressive, that they're fundamentally invested in the status quo. There's a tactic that people do so that when you get concerned about X issue, they say, well, what about, you know, all of these other issues? How can you ignore this, that, and the other? It must mean that you're racist, or that you're sexist, or that you're this, or that you're that. And that I think that it's really easy to fall into that argument, or fall into that spiral of saying, like, you know, if I'm vocally supporting one issue, are people going to think that I don't support the others? It's a bullshit argument. It's a way of shutting down dissent. And so I think, you know, that thing of like, it's okay to have your one issue, and just make sure that your one issue is like, you know, an issue, you know, a good issue. There are many good issues to embrace, and just talk about it all the time and get involved all the time. I think that's really smart. The other thing that I'll say is, and this goes to the I'm not a hopeful person thing, is that there has been some great journalism, as you say, coming from state and local outlets. There has been some fantastic journalism coming out of student newspapers. Like, I think the Columbia Spectator, for example, has been just extraordinary in covering the what's been happening at Columbia, for example. But you know, as with so many of our institutions, including the healthcare system, including all sorts of things, you know, so much of that media landscape has been consumed by, you know, a single corporation or a couple of corporations, which then limits what really can be done at the local level. And I think you know, some of the smaller newspapers are now being honestly written by AI. A lot of the kind of, not the important stuff, but the sports coverage, whatever. I think there's you know, and I think that you know, predatory capitalism has a lot to do with the way in which we've limited our options and so yeah, I think, you know, at this point, I feel like every activist I talk to is thinking about how to start their own newsletter, or newspaper, how to start their own, right? Because it feels so difficult to kind of use the outlets that exist in any sort of meaningful way, or leverage them in any sort of meaningful way. So I get the frustration. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Nikole.